There are so many things to be excited about when it comes to the 2025 season, and Kimi Antonelli is certainly one of them. Toto Wolff has not been coy about saying that he's basically the Max Verstappen that got away back in 2015, and even at 18 years old, being thrusted into a race-winning team for 2025 to make his rookie debut, there is going to be a lot of pressure, there is going to be a lot of scrutiny from both the fans and also the media, and whether you think that it's fair or not for an 18-year-old to be judged like this, he is going to be judged as either a failure or a success in 2025. And now, regardless if you're an 18-year-old rookie or even a world champion, your season is only going to be as good as the car underneath you. I think that Mercedes in Bahrain had a very positive preseason test. Even though it was incredibly close between Red Bull, Ferrari and Mercedes, there is a very good argument to say that Mercedes probably go into the season with the second best car on the grid. Right from day one, the Mercedes W16 for 2025 looked like a much more balanced and much more consistent car in terms of drivability from the very first run. There was no need compared to other teams like Red Bull or even McLaren for extended periods in the garage with lots of running with Flovis because, to be honest, by day 3, most of those teams were still trying simulations, they were still trying different setups to get the best balance out of their car, whilst the Mercedes seemed just as consistent on day 1 as it did at the end of day 3. They also had impeccable reliability, and once again, they seemed to be very happy with the setup and balance from very early on. The drivers looked incredibly comfortable on all 3 days and were really able to push. And although we still don't know the ultimate pace and the ultimate potential of the car, because that is something that we're only going to find out for real during qualifying in Australia, it definitely looked trackside like the car was much more responsive on corner entry, definitely much more stable on corner exit, and undoubtedly an improvement visually compared to the W15 last year. Unsurprisingly, by the end of day 3, the team kind of started to go into expectation management mode and kind of started to underplay just how good their test is. Now that is very understandable because even though they looked really good, when those expectations start to rise, sometimes they can just set you up for failure. And when you look at Mercedes and how, let's call it, underwhelming they have been during this regulation cycle, I don't blame them one bit for trying to play down expectations ahead of the season. There's no doubt that the cooler conditions at Bahrain during preseason testing definitely helped Mercedes. We know that the Mercedes works best in cold conditions, and that's something very unique to their car that they've had over the past couple of years. And let's not forget that the actual Bahrain Grand Prix will be in April in a month's time under very different conditions. Even George Russell himself said that the conditions helped Mercedes look better than they perhaps were, and that is just not something that we're used to a driver saying. It's strange for a team and a driver to admit that their car still has that kind of trait, and again, it's all part of playing down expectations, but when it comes to Antonelli, he is not going to have a reference to what it was last year because although he did take part in a couple of FP1 sessions, that is not the same as experiencing that car and those traits over the course of a 24-race season. The only slight concern for Mercedes going away from testing was the fact that more than any other team, both of their drivers seemed to lock up more than anyone else. And now this points to a bit of instability, and in a way you can look at it as perhaps a good thing because maybe their drivers just had so much confidence in the car that they really wanted to push the limits and the boundaries of what it can do, and hence they were locking up as much as they were. Or the more perhaps plausible explanation is the fact that they were having to run the car very low and very stiff when it comes to their suspension to get the peak performance that they wanted. And now this is something that we have seen from Mercedes basically for the past few years, and that is not a good thing. The Mercedes has always been a bit of a Goldilocks car because when the conditions, both on track and also the ambient conditions, are absolutely perfect and the car has the right setup, it can be a race winner and sometimes even a dominant car. But the fact that they were still locking up as much as they were, which points to that instability and how stiff the car looked, Mercedes yet again might have a very fast and very drivable car going into 25, but yet again it might lack that adaptability across a range of different ride heights on all of the tracks regardless of how bumpy they are, and also in all conditions. And now, regardless over the questions that surround the W16, when it comes to Antonelli, I think for the most part he had almost the perfect test. We always knew that he was a very talented driver. You don't win the amount of championships that he has won at his age without having immense car control. But that question over how fast would he really be in Formula 1 machinery during a competitive session along other, even World Championship caliber drivers, that is the thing that I think all of us were looking forward to finding out. And now, Mercedes as a team did more laps than any other team. Russell completed 232 laps, and Antonelli was not far behind on 226. In terms of Antonelli's fastest lap, he was just over 0.2 of a second slower than George Russell, and whilst you can't compare Kimi to other drivers from other teams, drivers within the same team are gonna do similar programs, and given how much progress Mercedes made, to be honest, more than any other team, they had a very complete test, which means at some point both of the drivers did have a chance to run on low fuel, and being just over 0.2 slower than George Russell on probably very similar programs, I think that was extremely impressive, and Antonelli was much closer to Russell than, say, Lawson was to Max Verstappen. The most fascinating thing when watching Kimi drive was undoubtedly his driving style. On shorter stints and on lower fuel runs, he was so aggressive with his car placement, running very wide over entry curbs, and also very aggressive with his steering inputs when pushing the car, especially into corners. Now, his driving ability and just that raw talent clearly allows him to hustle a lap time out of that car, which is fantastic to see, and it clearly gave him a lot of confidence to do so. And now, whilst that was interesting to watch, when it came to the long runs, both Antonelli and also Russell managed to do a complete race simulation, which is not something that all of the drivers were able to do. Antonelli did it on day 2, with Russell doing it on day 3, and even though Antonelli's race simulation was actually faster than Russell's, and that is because he did it on day 2 when all of the times were quicker for all of the drivers and all of the teams, when it came to the consistency, it was clear as day, and you could really see the experience gap between the two drivers, because Antonelli was nowhere near as consistent as George Russell, and the variance in his times across all of the tyres during his race simulation was just a lot more than George Russell. And now, that is just a consequence of his very aggressive driving style, which at the moment just doesn't translate as easily when it comes to race stints. The Pirellis we have now are extremely sensitive, and when you do put a lot of aggressive inputs both in terms of throttle and steering through corners, it can cause the tyres to spike in temperatures very easily throughout a lap, and sometimes it takes even a lap for those temperatures to recover. Bahrain itself is a very abrasive circuit, and so this was always a great but difficult test for Kimi to do, and it will be very interesting to see how much he learns when we come back there in a month's time. If Mercedes are able to bring this well-balanced and also very drivable car that we saw during Bahrain testing to all of the races at the beginning of the season, then I think qualifying more than anything else could get very, very interesting between Antonelli and Russell. When it comes to the Grand Prix, I think Antonelli is going to experience the exact same difficulties that Piastri did in 2023. Tyre management, race IQ, and just general decision making is what's going to be very challenging for him in his rookie season. And then doing it across a range of different tracks, and that challenge being different when you get into different tracks, that is where we're going to see the real weakness of his inexperience. However, if Mercedes can give him a more consistent car, that is going to help him develop quicker. Because when your car is so inconsistent like the W15 was last year, it makes the challenge very different and very varied across all of the tracks, and it keeps moving the goalpost of trying to find the right balance that could work across all of the tracks, even for experienced drivers like George Russell and Lewis Hamilton. However, when it comes to qualifying, this is where I think Antonelli might be able to kind of raise a few eyebrows and make a few headlines at the beginning of the season. I could definitely see him start out-qualifying Russell in the first maybe 4 or 5 races. I think for him, the big results are going to be centered around track position, because around lower deck tracks where overtaking could perhaps be very difficult, if he nails the qualifying and then is just able to manage the race from there, I think that there is every chance that he could score an early podium, or maybe even an early Grand Prix win, which to me almost feels inevitable in a 24-race season. And now, the one thing that we have to prepare for, and the one thing that feels maybe even more inevitable than his first Grand Prix win, is the fact that he could be maybe even a little bit crash-prone. Given his inexperience, and especially his driving style in a Mercedes that historically has been very tricky when it's been run very stiff, I think it almost guarantees that we are going to see him make mistakes and potentially crash a little bit, especially in qualifying. balancing his confidence and that bravery of putting everything on the line in a qualifying run and trying not to go over the limit too much and trying to extract too much performance out of the car that just isn't there. I think that that's going to define potentially his season, because whilst I do think that he's going to make mistakes, how he bounces back and more importantly, how quickly he's able to put it behind him, that's what's really going to show how good of a driver he is, because the best drivers and the world champions are literally the ones that could potentially have a massive crash in FP3 and still be able to go and take pole position in qualifying. When it comes to preparation and setting a driver up for success in Formula 1, I think that Toto and Mercedes have done everything in their power to give Kimi the best preparation possible. This is something that I have often criticized Red Bull for, because when it comes to Kimi, Toto Wolff himself said that Kimi before preseason testing had already had 9,000 kilometers worth of running in older cars, and if you include the 1,223 kilometers that he did in Bahrain testing, that is a total already of over 10,000 kilometers worth of running in Formula 1 cars. And now, for context, a Formula 1 Grand Prix is 305 kilometers, meaning that Kimi's mileage already in Formula 1 cars before he's even made his rookie debut equates to over 33 Grand Prix distances. He is also a very mature and very well PR trained 18-year-old, which I think is going to put him in good stead when it comes to handling the pressure, and I think in general he just has the perfect environment of a great team, a team boss that clearly wants him, and also his family around him for the start of the season. Even though Kimi doesn't have a contract for 2026, Toto Wolff has already said in an interview that they are basically using 25 as a preparation year for 26. To me, that basically says that his future is almost a guarantee. I just do not see a scenario where Kimi could be kicked out of Mercedes, because for that to happen, he would have to be massively crash prone and massively incompetent, kind of akin to Logan Sargent. After what we just saw during Bahrain testing, there just isn't a world where I see that as even a remote possibility, but I guess if it does become a reality, they do have Valtteri Bottas there who could step in and obviously do a very solid job. But apart from Bottas, there isn't even that many realistic options for 2026 of drivers who are good enough to perform at the level Mercedes would want. When I look at the dynamic inside of Mercedes, even though Antonelli is the young driver, 18-year-old potential future champion with all of these expectations and all of this pressure, Russell is still going to be expected to not just beat him, but beat him pretty comfortably. I still think the majority of the pressure is going to be on George Russell. He is now the team leader in the absence of Lewis Hamilton, but at the same time he is a team leader with no contract for 2026. That is something that you just can't say about Max Verstappen at Red Bull, Leclerc at Ferrari, or Norris at McLaren. Toto, we know, is going to continue to try to chase Max in 2025, and if Max suddenly decides that Red Bull is no longer the place to be, and actually Mercedes is on a much better trajectory and also in a much better place to nail the engine regs in 26, we know that out of those two drivers, Kimi and George, it is going to be Russell who makes way for Verstappen. George is a very smart person. He is more than aware of the pressure and the expectations that are on his shoulders. He's also a very savvy and very experienced operator, having learned a lot from his time with Lewis as his teammate. However, having said that, his vulnerability, if you want to call it that, could definitely be a potential advantage for Kimi to exploit. As unlikely as this is, it is not impossible and it is not beyond the realms of possibility that Kimi Antonelli could beat George Russell in his rookie season. We saw Lewis do something pretty similar against Alonso, who was a defending two-time world champion in his rookie season in 2007. The only way that I could see this happening is if somehow Kimi's raw talent and his raw speed in qualifying perhaps surprises Russell at the beginning of the season, and along with the contract unknowns and whether or not Toto even trusts him to lead the team, maybe all of that can start to shake George's confidence. The truth is that the number one driver is not determined by contracts or someone simply saying it into existence. The number one driver has always and will always be determined by the speed that they have in the car, and it is going to be the exact same situation at Mercedes in 2025. Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video and want to support the channel, then don't forget to subscribe. That would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.